welcome back to Organized Chaos. I'm Jen Clymer, and as promised, we've got an incredible program lined up for you now. It's Behind the Book. Join me on Zoom, won't you? Well, hello, everybody.
Hi, Jen.
Hi. I'm going to hand it off to Freda to give you a little bit of a setup of who we're being joined by. If you have questions and you're on the campus, call us at 1221, but please wait towards the end of the program. If you are joining us on Zoom and have questions, please go ahead and chat them in the Q&A section, and I will be answering them on a different computer. Freda, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to have Hawk back and Vicki Riskin, who Hawk will formally introduce. For those of you who have not joined us before, because this is all new and virtual, we started this series a year and a half ago on campus for the residents to bring world-class authors and their fabulous works to campus. I guess the silver lining from the pandemic is we've gone virtual, and that means we can open it up to everyone. Hawk has agreed to be our host, which has added another wonderful element because he knows everything there is to know about Hollywood and pretty much everything else. So I'm super excited that Vicki is here. She was originally supposed to come to our campus in March, and it was a very sad call when I had to let her know that we were postponing it. But here she is, and we're very excited. Our families have a lot of parallels, which we had spoken about, so that's why I'm very excited to hear more of what she had to say. The book is phenomenal. I highly recommend everybody going into the link and ordering it. And you're going to have a great hour and a half. So Hawk, take it away.
Thank you, Freda, and thank you, Jen, and hi, residents, and hi, Facebook friends, and anybody else who happens to be on. Not watching the convention, it's not on till later today. I'm introducing right there is Vicki Riskin, we're going to discuss her book, which is captivating and poignant. It's called Wray and Robert Riskin, a Hollywood memoir. Hold it up there, Vicki. Let everybody see what the cover is. There you go. For those of you who may not know, Wray started in the silence, and her biggest claim to fame, I guess, was the starring role as the femme fatale in King Kong. Robert Riskin won an Oscar for writing It Happened One Night, and wrote many, many other great films, including Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and Lost Horizon. Vicki herself is no slouch. She is accomplished. She's a psychotherapist, a TV writer and producer, and a human rights activist, and she's on the board of NPR. That's all, just a few things. The Associated Press, I want to quote something they said about this book, just to give you an idea. If there was an Academy Award for movie books, Victoria Riskin would be making room beside the Oscar her father won. Part biography, part Hollywood history, part love story. Associated Press. So Vicki, welcome. How you doing? How's the East Coast?
It's great. I'm on Martha's Vineyard, and it's beautiful and sunny and humid. Anyway, I'm happy to be here on my little island.
Well, we're all happy that you said you'd come and do this with us. Now you've been writing a long time for TV and producing a long time. How did the book come about, and what were your goals for writing this book?
Well, I had been producing and writing in Los Angeles, and we moved full-time to Santa Barbara, and we're ready, David and I, my husband, David Rintells, who's a wonderful writer, and who you know and know about. We decided to retreat to Santa Barbara, and I was looking for a new challenge. And I sat next to a wonderful woman at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. I didn't know her. And as we started chatting, she told me that she taught memoir writing. She had a memoir writing group, and your Molly is in that group now.
Are we allowed to say Maureen Murdoch?
You can say Maureen Murdoch. She's wonderful. And she has a new book out about memoir writing. So I joined the group, and the women were fantastic, and they encouraged me with my little bits of writing, mostly about my memories of growing up and other little vignettes. When I came to the end of it, Hawk, I realized I didn't really have a book yet. I had series of chapters, but it didn't all tie together. And I gave it to someone, and they said, I really want to know more about your parents. And I thought, I really want to know more about my parents. I'm at that stage in life where there are holes in my understanding of who they were, where they came from. And I think, like everyone at this stage of life, when you start going on ancestry.com or you start digging through boxes, you're trying to create the final tapestry of who you are and where you came from. And I became obsessed with the book. It was a wonderful journey after that, after I knew where I was going.
So you had to do obviously tremendous amount of research. Where did you find everything you needed to, like, for instance, the book talks about your mother's backstory and where she came from. And oh my God, to get to Hollywood was wild. Did you find that in a scrapbook somewhere, or how did that come about?
So my mother lived 97 years. And so I knew a good deal about her life, and she had written an autobiography. And then she had left me a bunch of boxes with letters and more details, photographs, and so on. So I dove into her story. And while she had written about it in her autobiography, and I'd asked her, peppered her with questions about, well, how do you feel about this? Or what about that? I felt I was coming at the story with a different lens, which was the lens of imagining this little girl who was 14 years old, who was put on a train by herself in the care of a young man in his 20s, who was a photographer, and who had said to her mother, I'm going to Los Angeles, I'm going to Hollywood to try to make a career, and I think I could get Faye into the movies.
Now this is from a tiny town in Utah called Lark, Utah, right?
Well, she started her seminal years from about 4 to 10. She lived in a mining town, and her mother was a rather prideful woman who had been college educated, and to find herself in this dreadful little dusty mining town and not have very much money, and it was humiliating. And she had 6 children. My grandmother and my grandfather separated. He took off. And so she had these 6 children, and they moved to Salt Lake City first to try to find family to help them and get a little house, which they did. And all the kids got little jobs, including my mother. She entered a contest selling newspapers to see, and if you won, you got a little screen test. That was the prize. And that's what got her excited about maybe being in the movies. But it was 1918, 19, 20, 21. And you know what was going on then? It was World War I. It was the famous flu epidemic. Everyone in the family got sick. There wasn't enough food to eat. Her older sister died. So when my grandmother let her go, this little girl go to Hollywood in the care of this young man, I think in part she felt, well, maybe that'll work out okay and there'll be one less mouth to feed. The problem was that when my mother got on the train with this young man, who everyone thought was the boyfriend of her older sister, he said to her, but Faye, it's you I love. And she was, as you can imagine, emotionally tormented by that. But he did look out for her.
But he didn't take advantage of her, even though he was in his 20s and she was 14.
He sort of straddled that fence between a crush on her and being an older brother or a caretaker. And he really believed in her. He thought she was talented and smart. She was very smart. And he groomed her in a way by educating her, teaching her about poetry and literature and art. And so the education she would never have gotten was really, the groundwork was laid for.
Homeschooled her.
Pardon me?
He homeschooled her.
He homeschooled her and then he got her into school and made sure she got straight A's, you know, and then her mother came and fetched her and decided that she'd made a mistake, and she was very angry at this guy.
So how did she get into, did she get hired as an extra or something on movies? How did she finally get actually into the silence?
I think this guy, his name is Bill Mortensen. And he was determined to help my mother. So even when he was banished from seeing her, he arranged for a producer to walk down the same street that my mother was walking down with her mother. And this producer offered her a little part, just a tiny little part. And she had to play a clown, and she just loved that. And she had a little clown suit. And so that also gave her confidence. And then by herself, she got on the trolley car and went to Hal Roach Studios and said, I want to be in movies. And the head of production, you could just walk on. It was like there were no gates and no gate guards. The head of production said, fine, start on Monday. And she started on Monday making little comedies with Charlie Chase and some of the regulars who were part of that wonderful comedy group for Hal Roach Studios. And she was usually the brunt of the joke or the pretty girl, but she worked every day. And then her contract came to an end, and Carl Laemmle was looking for young girls to work in his Westerns. Universal was starting to make Westerns. So by now she could afford a car, and she had a little driver's license, and she would go over the hill from Hollywood, the Cahuenga Pass, as we all know, who live in Los Angeles, and go to Universal Studios. And she began to star in Westerns, sometimes driving over the hill with Janet Gaynor, her best friend, you know. They were beginning to make their way. And she always had a sense of confidence in herself. I just think you're born with that. She had a feeling that she was destined for something special. And that was baked in from the time she was a little girl.
Wow. Well, Marion C. Cooper was I guess a movie director and a documentary filmmaker. And maybe you could talk a little bit about him and how he came up with the idea, or where he went and then came back and decided to make this movie King Kong.
So Marion C. Cooper and his partner, Ernest B. Schoedsack, are two of the most interesting characters of the 20th century.
And in your book.
And they happen to be, I couldn't not tell their story in the book, but
Fabulous.
Yeah, it's there is a biography about Marion C. Cooper that's wonderful reading by a man named Mark Voss, and the title is Living Dangerously, and that was Marion C. Cooper. As a young man, he became an ace pilot. He fought in World War I. His plane was downed. He was it caught on fire. It was shot down. His hands burned. He couldn't steer the steering rod, so he used his elbows and landed the plane. He was, after that war, he went and helped set up the Polish Air Force. He put the Polish Air Force together. He wanted to protect the Poles against the Russians. He was shot down by the Russians. He was in a prison camp. That was all before he started making movies. He and his friend, Ernest B. Schoedsack, began to go, Ernest Schoedsack was a technical genius, and they started making movies together. And at that time, people were interested in the far remote parts of the world that they'd never seen. So these two guys went to Persia, as they called it then, and followed a tribe of 50,000 people who were moving their animals across a pass 20,000 feet high in search of food during the winter. And they brought a woman along because she helped underwrite it, and she was a journalist. And flash forward, when they finally landed in Hollywood, it's basically the story of King Kong. Because story of adventurers, a producer who wants to go to some dramatic and remote place, brings a woman along. And by that time, these two guys were married and having children. So they recreated this adventuresome life in King Kong.
And so they get a screenplay written. They also know about special effects. And how does your mother get the role?
Well, my mother had already done, this is like 1933. So from the little girl doing Westerns, she then does a lead role for an Eric von Stroheim movie called The Wedding March. She gets a full-time contract at Paramount. And by 1933, the studios were crashing because of the Depression. They were losing money hand over fist and ending contracts. So she had already made a movie with Marion C Cooper called Four Feathers. It was a silent movie, and he just
was remade later with Laurence Olivier, right?
Remade 2 or 3 times after, maybe 4 times.
Right.
It's so she was in that, and he thought she was wonderful. And she was in a play in New York and came back. She was in a play in New York with a fellow named Archibald Leach. Cary
Grant, yes.
And when she came back to Hollywood to go back to work, he called her in and he said, "Faye, I am going to star you opposite the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood." And she thought, well, maybe it's Cary Grant. We had such a great time doing this play, or maybe it's Clark Gable, or, you name a bunch of other people. And then he showed her this picture of Kong, and she laughed. They had a great repartee connection.
Well, they fell in love, the king and your mom.
But her relationship with Cooper and with Schoedsack lasted the rest of their lives.
Exactly.
Wonderful guys, and she adored them and they adored her.
Well, let's stop about your mom now for a while, which is also interesting about the book. You're able to really seamlessly go from what was happening with your mom to what was happening with your dad, and finally how they got together. So let's stop a minute and talk about now your dad. He grew up Lower East Side, was it, of New York? How did his life get into the movie business?
He was born, it's very much the Jewish immigrant story. His parents came from Belarus. He's the first generation kids of these Jewish immigrants born on the Lower East Side. And when they have a little money, his father's a tailor. They moved to Brooklyn ultimately, which was like upscale for those who were downscale. And he got a little job. He quit school when he was after the 6th grade, and he got a job ultimately working in the garment business. And these 2 guys who owned this company, a little company making ties, had invested in some silent movies in Florida. And they showed him, he's now about 17, they showed him some of the movies and asked his opinion, and he said, "They stink." And they said, "Well, what do you know?" And he said, "I'm telling you, no one's going to buy those movies. And here's what's wrong with them." And so sure enough, nobody bought the films, and you could sell almost anything in those days. And so they sent him down to Florida to become the writer, producer, director, even an extra in these silent comedies that he called clever comedies with a K. And he made over, I think, 100 of these little short comedies, bringing some actors down from New York. And that really trained him in the art of movie making. And then the war came, World War I, and he was for a time in the Navy. And when he got out, he was back in New York and he started to make little movies, but then he transitioned into writing and producing Broadway plays. He was very successful. I mean, not enormously successful, but doing extremely well, writing with his girlfriend at the time, which is a whole other interesting story. How do you find out about the girlfriend? And then came the crash and Broadway closed, absolutely shut down. And he had no money. His bank account was emptied within a few weeks. And a friend who was representing Warner Brothers called him in and said, you know, you have this play, we'd like to buy it. And my father said, okay. And the guy said, how much do you want for it? And he said, $50,000. Well, I mean, $50,000 was like asking for 5 million in today's dollars. And the guy said, you're absolutely wacky and get out of my office. And my dad left and the guy followed him and said, wait, no, come on, let's talk seriously. And brought him.
Wait, let me interrupt you, because what you said in the book, which is what I loved, is he went to the elevator. And
that comes in. You're jumping ahead of me, but that's
okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Well, maybe I truncated it a little in the book, but he brings him back in and he says, no, seriously, how much do you want? And he said, okay. My dad said, okay, I'll settle for 40,000. And the guy said, forget it. And he goes to the elevator, but he said he detected the guy was really eager, urgent to get it. So he walks to the elevator very slowly, hoping someone will follow him. The guy will follow him. He presses the button, the elevator comes. They used to have elevator guys, and the guy says, you going down? He says, no, and going up. The doors close, he waits. This happens 2 or 3 more times. The guy comes racing out and he says, come back. Comes back and they settled for $30,000. Overnight, he was rich and he got on the train and came to Hollywood.
And what I understand, I think, if I remember correctly, is they had already started making the movie of his play, but they didn't tell him. So that's why he needed to buy the rights right away, correct?
Later, he thought I should have I should have come back and asked for the 50,000 again. But yeah, it was called Illicit and with Barbara Stanwyck, and it's a wonderful little movie. So they were already in the middle of filming it. And then he came out really under contract to Columbia and Harry Cohn.
Harry Cohn, yes. Well, what did you learn about him as a screenwriter, his craft, his philosophy, and what he was trying to say? Because a lot of his movies had a very similar theme to them.
That's true. I think that's unusual for screenwriters. There are probably a few but many of his characters, you can track this, are people who've gone off track in terms of their moral compass and are struggling to find their way back. So you think about Mr. Deeds, or you think about Meet John Doe, or you think about even It Happened One Night, and the young heiress who's gone off track because she's going to marry this guy who's an idiot, right? Even her father, who's wealthy, is worried about. So he was very interested in people finding their way back to who they really were or are. And he was quite concerned about the economic times and what people were going through. So there are often themes of the wealthy versus the not wealthy, but done in a kind of warm and loving way. So even with Mr. Deeds, there's a lot of warmth and humor, but it's a guy who's inherited $20 million and he doesn't really want it. It makes him miserable. He's suddenly being pursued by all kinds of nefarious characters, and he has to figure out how to get out from under it. And the other character, is a woman who's just following him and getting close to him for a story, and then realizes he's really is a good person, and this is what she's been looking for. So he always poured himself into his screenplays. They are not written for anybody else. They're written from his heart and poured onto the page. Even Lost Horizon, which came from, of course, from the wonderful little mini novella. But again, it's a character who is unhappy. He's a diplomat. He has everything you could imagine, but he doesn't, the world that he lives in is constricting socially, and he finds this magical place and he has to make a decision. So he always had a theme that he was working with, and a character who was struggling to say something or work out a problem. And but he also was not formulaic in his approach to writing. So he would never have, I think, sanctioned these books that tell you by page 30 such and such has to happen, or it's not a good screenplay. You know, that really has, and the minor characters were extremely important in his screenplays. Every single one of them had these idiosyncratic qualities. And the other thing, and I feel a little sheepish about saying this, he wrote in the screenshots. And that would never happen today. And a director would be very offended, but it was just the way he did it. And and Capra was fine with it. So as he would say, sometimes a scene can be 2 or 3 pages, just a 2-shot of characters, because something really interesting is going on. And then you have to keep moving in other scenes, keep moving the story along. So somehow screenwriting for him was absolutely instinctive. And maybe it was his background in Broadway, but I think he just, like a fish to water, he took to the medium.
Yeah, he had amazing talent with a 6th grade education. Pretty amazing. He also, I think there's a quote about the rules about writing a screenplay.
Right. He says there are no rules.
Right.
But of course, then he does outline some of the things that he does. Like he says, he said, I think in terms of a 3-act structure, but within each scene is a 3-act structure. You know, an issue and a climax and a resolution. So that was sort of his general philosophy. But I think anybody who's read screenplays, written screenplays, appreciated great screenwriters. William Goldman writes very differently than Robert Towne. I shouldn't talk to you about Robert Towne and his process, because that's a whole, but you know, for writer, I think it's important for writers to find their own way of putting down on paper the picture, the movie that we all want to see.
All right, so you're starting to write TV movies yourself, and you're sitting in front of your typewriter before computers, I think, maybe computers. And is there a little, is your father's voice in there, and you're thinking about what your father did, or did you go in a totally different direction? How did it affect you, knowing who your father was and how he wrote?
Well, I didn't compare myself to him, because that would have been like comparing yourself, you know, if you're starting out, to the champ. But I did understand, I could appreciate his gifts even more, and struggled, you know, writing, even a screenplay writing is a struggle, because you'd only have so much time, and it has to be compact, and you have to move the story along, and, you know, all the things. So I really admired how economical, how smart he was, how great sense of story structure. So I didn't feel as intimidated by his legacy, but I could understand as things began to work in a script, how exciting that was for him. And he thought about his characters all the time. I mean, sometimes he would just stay up all night and be making notes, and he lived with those people. We had a dog named Mr. Deeds. I mean, his movies came into our life.
Right. Now, I think one of the first contracts he had was with Harry Cohn, who was infamous as a very tough boss. And what I hear is that at least in the book, that your father stood up to him.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, Harry Cohen's probably maligned more than he deserves to be, although I don't know, maybe he deserves to be maligned. And he was certainly a chased the women constantly, but he admired good writers and he admired people who talked back to him. And he came to really rely on my dad, not only to do these films that he did with Capra, and they were a wonderful collaborative team, but by 1935, 36, I found this in the family papers. He gave any new project that was coming into the studio, he gave my father the book to read or the script to read or the story to read. And so I think he really appreciated him. That being said, because he could be so dictatorial and unyielding and horrible at times, the writers figured out ways to play tricks on Harry Cohen. So they had as much fun with Cohen by teasing him as they did. The writers particularly were unintimidated. I think about the little vignette when Joe Swirling, who was my father's best friend and a wonderful screenwriter, his wife was not a very good driver, and she backed into Harry Cohen's Rolls Royce. And Harry Cohen screamed at him, "What the hell is your wife doing, hitting my car?" And Swirling said, "Oh, I'm sorry. She thought you were in it at the time." So they would talk back to him or tease him. When my dad was working on a film, Cohen pushed him to direct and write, and he didn't really want to be a director. And at one point he went in and threw a script on Cohen's desk and said, "I don't know who the writer is, but get me somebody better." And he was the writer. So there was a lot of playfulness, and people in the film business do wonderful, silly things when they're feeling lighthearted. It's just a great band of people. I found that in my job as a producer. I loved the people who worked in the film business who were working for me, because they'll kill for you. Is that not right? I mean, it's just remarkable family that you create. And I know my dad felt that way and my mother felt that way.
Yeah, no, I've talked about that a lot, and everybody out at the home knows we are still all a family, and that's why we take care of our own is our mantra out at the home. So he made, I think, 6 films with Capra,
Right.
and he had they had a good relationship, but then things started to mess up. Kind of talk about that if you can.
Well, that was complicated to go back and trace. I certainly read Capra's biography, his story about himself, his autobiography. I read the biography, great piece of research done by Joseph McBride. And then I read all the newspaper reports, everything I can get my hands on about this working relationship. And I would say for the most part, these two men had a good relationship. And that goes to my father's character, because other people who worked with Capra found him difficult. And the two men just bounced off each other and trusted each other. And I'm sure my father felt that when Capra got the camera rolling, there was nobody better. You know, he had a great sense of timing, and he had a great sense of moving, you know, how the sets were created, and the actors trusted him. And I think for Capra, he never before or after really had the kind of screenwriting storyteller to work with, or whose work he could realize. So, and then of course the famous story, if you don't mind my interjecting, about the 100
That's I was looking for this one. Yeah.
And after it was interesting for me to analyze this, that maybe my background in psychology helped, but after Capra and Riskin made It Happen One Night, they thought this was just a little throwaway picture, and it swept all the top Oscars, all 5 top Oscars. I mean, it was just the talk of the town. It was huge. Capra went into a depression. he couldn't figure out what had happened, and he wasn't sure he could ever recreate that. And it was a serious depression. He withdrew. He went to, he had all kinds of psychosomatic symptoms. And so my dad just kept sending him little notes and come back. We miss you. He was hiding out in the Palm Desert. And then Capra sort of had a turnaround, and he began to think that he was an important director. And there was the Capra touch and the Capra-esque films, and it was Capra this and Capra that. And he'd hired a PR firm. And now he's getting a lot of press about Capra, about the Frank Capra films. And so my dad's getting a little, kind of not annoyed, but a little unhappy about the flood of everything now Capra. Because before that, it was always Riskin and Capra. So my dad went into his office and gave him 100 pieces of blank paper and said, Frank, why don't you put the Capra touch on that? And that story has been told and retold, and writers repeat it, and nobody knows if it really happened. My dad said that never happened, but his brother said it absolutely did happen. And he was one of the people who was spreading the story around. And to this day, at the Writers Guild Awards, someone will get up and periodically and tell that story. But it is true that without the screenplay, a really good, well-written screenplay, you are not going to have a good movie.
Yeah. As a former president of the Writers Guild, I'm sure all the writers out there are clapping, and members of the DGA are going, well, it's mainly us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's gone on for years. But in the early days of Capra and Riskin, all the headlines were another out-of-the-box hit from Riskin and Capra. It was never just Capra.
Right.
Not until much later, really, until the post-war years.
All right, now we're going to go back to your mom.
Okay.
I'm trying to get all this in here because I know people are going to be so interested. Your mom got married to who at the time looked like Mr. Perfect in Hollywood.
Right.
And it was a tough marriage. Was that hard for you to write about? And given that it wasn't your parents, and maybe tell us a little bit about that marriage, and I think really delves into the character of who your mom was.
Yeah. Well, she was married to a man named John Monk Saunders, who wrote Wings. It was the first movie to win an Academy Award. He'd been an Oxford scholar. He'd been an Olympic swimmer. He was incredibly good looking. What's not to like, right? There's nothing wrong with this picture. And he romanced my mother quite aggressively. But he had a problem, and it had to do with alcohol and womenizing, and ultimately medicines that the doctor gave him that he became addicted to. So she marries this golden boy, and she's crazy about him. And it's her first love, her first real relationship. And very quickly she begins to realize that it's clear that he's not going to be faithful to her. He's very honest about it. He tells her more than she even wants to know. He's having an affair with the wife of the head of the studio, Jesse Lasky's wife, where my mother's under contract and he's under contract.
And they're going to dinners and parties, and the affair is there, and the wife is there.
And the wife is there, and Lasky has his own, special lady friend. And for a girl in her early 20s, this is all very confusing. And it was very hurtful to her when she understood that this was going to be a regular thing in their lives. And at one moment, and I was so moved by this, this one little moment where she's at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel and he goes off to be with Bessie, and she begs him not to go, and he does anyway. And she said to herself, and this told me a lot about her character, I am never going to let anyone hurt me that way again, get me down, allow me to think poorly of myself. They move into a beautiful home, and she goes to work. She poured herself into work, and I'm going to say this, not just because of who I'm talking to, is true. The people who were there for her were the makeup people and the set designers and all, camera people. They were like a family, and they emotionally held her and made her feel good. And she wanted to do right by them. And she struggled through this marriage, but over time, I think as he falls apart, she became his caretaker. And then ultimately, his addiction was so severe that she asked for a divorce because she now had a little baby and a child, and she didn't feel safe around him. So he says, you had to ask for a divorce if you were a woman, right? So he says, I'll grant you a divorce. And a few months later, she goes off to do summer stock and leaves my sister in the care of a nanny. And he kidnapped my sister and disappeared. That was a really hard time. So I had to learn all about the characters around him. Adela Rogers St. John. My mother gets a lawyer. It's Wild Bill Donovan to go find my sister. All of these complicated relationships.
And she's starting to get involved with Clifford Odets, I think, at the time.
Clifford Odets. Right. So part of my research was learning about Clifford Odets and their relationship. And I spent some time with Clifford Odets' son, and we talked a lot about his father, my mother, their relationship. And so that was also a disappointing relationship for her. Odets was brilliant, no doubt about it. I think when they were dating, he had 3 plays on Broadway, but he was a tormented soul. And ultimately they were going to get married, but he backed out.
Couldn't handle it. Yeah. So in the golden age, as we talked about Harry Cohn, we've heard stories about Daryl Zanuck and Adolph Zucker and Jesse Lasky, Carl Laemmle, et cetera. The manners of those studio heads and executives were not exactly prior to the Me Too movement. And there's a great Carol Lombard story in your book that I kind of love about a woman putting a studio head in his place.
Well, yes. The reason I write about Carol Lombard is because she made a film that my dad wrote called Virtue, in which she plays a prostitute. Okay. So a year and a half or so after that, my father and Carol were in regular company. They were dating, and there was, but I loved this story about Carol Lombard. First of all, Carol Lombard, as beautiful as she was, she could be foul-mouthed, right? She could sling the insults and the 4-letter words as good as any truck driver, which she had learned as a teenager, because she asked her brothers, tell me all the terrible things, swear words I can learn so I can protect myself from the boys who were chasing after me. So she comes in to see Harry Cohn to be considered for this part as a prostitute. She walks in and he says, well, you look like a hooker. And she, in an instant, says, you should know what a hooker looks like. And he laughs and he starts to unzip his pants. And she looks at him and said, Mr. Cohn, I'll be in your shitty little movie, but I'm not going to fuck you to do it. And he pulled up his pants, his zipper, and said, yes, ma'am, however she said it. And from that moment on, he treated her like a queen. So some of these guys, you just had to put them in their place. I don't think a lot of them were not nearly as horrific as we've heard about with Harvey Weinstein. When I'm talking about the Xanax and the Harry Cohns and but they certainly didn't mind taking advantage of their power and their authority, and did so.
I've got to go back a second. We have a question that I thought was interesting about Capra.
Yeah.
This is from somebody, I guess, on Facebook who said, with many younger film critics often quoting Capra, do you think your father's hugely influential and brilliant work is often overlooked or is in danger of being overlooked by contemporary students?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I could elaborate on that, but yes, I think that's that is unfortunate, because some people will even say, when Capra wrote It Happened One Night or Mr. Deeds, or Capra films are such and such. They rarely mention Robert Riskin. The knowledgeable, the really serious historians, the Joe McBrides of the world who wrote the biography of Capra, know his contribution and are very adulatory. But it's now become kind of written into the history. And some of it was done by Capra himself. You know, there are many directors who say, without this particular writer, you know, Billy Wilder, for example, would always give credit to Charles Brackett or to I.A.L. Diamond. You know, I mean, it was not one person does the whole thing. And we all know, anyone who's been in the movie business, you might have an editor who saved your bacon. You might have a set designer who makes a film look so much better than you could ever imagine.
It's a collaborative process.
It's a collaborative process. And so it's not just the writer who gets diminished by this auteur theory. It's everybody else who suddenly becomes invisible in service of the director. Now, there are directors who are extraordinarily gifted and they have a great team around them, but they know they have a great team. And without those people, I watched an Orson Welles movie the other night and thought, you know, there's less there than meets the eye, because he wrote the screenplay himself. And it unlike Citizen Kane, where he had a couple of very good screenwriters, well, Mankiewicz for one. So we have to appreciate everybody. You know, that's the brilliance.
I just have to tell a quick story.
Yeah.
Maybe some of you heard this before, but talking about collaboration, I was making a film called Wayne's World many years ago. And my youngest son, Robbie, who was, I think, 12 or 13 at the time, it was a Friday night. I brought him out to the set, and we're shooting on a street, and there's Wayne in the blue Pacer, and the guy from Terminator 2, Robert Patrick, plays a cop, and he's coming up to the Pacer. And when he comes up to the Pacer, he looks down, and his line was, do you know you were speeding? And my son, who's standing next to me, and the director and the writers, all of a sudden blurts out, well, that's not funny. And we all went, oh my God, a 13-year-old, oh geez, what that, right? And Mike Myers, to his credit, looked out of the car and said, hi, Robbie, why isn't it funny? And he said, well, in Terminator 2, the cop had a Polaroid of a kid and said, have you seen this boy? And that's what the cop would say. So they said, you know, he's right. We're going to take a Polaroid picture of a kid, and they took a picture of Robbie. And when the movie came out, he's in Wayne's World, my son, and it's got one of the biggest laughs at the time because everybody had just seen Terminator. So yes, it's a collaborative effort.
Oh my gosh, that is fabulous.
So it can happen from anybody, absolutely. And when you talked about Orson Welles, I just got the chills because there are so many moments in this book, and that's why I say, please, everybody, you got to read this book. There's a moment where your mother is sitting next to Orson Welles. He's with whoever he's with, and I think your mom was with Clifford Odets at the time. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting at the premiere of Citizen Kane in New York, I think at the Ziegfeld Theater. And I think, oh my God, one of the, it's always the first or the second greatest film of all time. And she's sitting next to Welles watching that movie for the very first time. Wow, what a moment.
Yeah, she was. And that was a kind of, she knew it was a great film, you know, and Odette's leaned over, and they were good friends. And she just, you know, Odette's just squeezed his hand and said, that's a, you know, I mean, it was just like a moment when you knew you'd seen something quite amazing. So.
Right. How did your mother how did she feel about the industry, given that I mean, when you read about the book, and it was a smaller industry then obviously than it is now. So everybody seemed to know each other, the actors, the writers, the directors. How did she feel about the industry herself? And then as she went on, because she continued.
Right. She went into television after, later.
Right.
She loved it. She absolutely, and I think both my parents loved the movie business. They felt this was like a great big family. They had a remarkable group of friends, many of them writers, but some producers who were intellectually brilliant, interesting, funny, great storytellers, wonderful poker games, lots of parties every time there was a, you know, Easter or 4th of July. We just grew up, I just thought everybody lived this way, you know. And a lot of social consciousness among our family, you know, our orbit of friends. Of course, that all had a kind of sour note later on during the blacklist, right? When being socially progressive, not so much for our family, but for our friends, many bad things happening. But it was, they loved the industry, and my father felt that movies could really change the world. He believed that film could influence people in a very positive way, how they felt about themselves, how they felt about the society they lived in, but never in a heavy-handed way. He was not a demagogue or writing political tracts. And for my mother, she felt she had a great role in the Depression, which was to bring a sense of relief and levity or entertainment to people who were suffering.
Right. Well, now we've seen that both your parents had different relationships. And then finally, kind of talk to us, because as I mentioned at the beginning, this also is a great love story, how the two of them met, and the love letters that have been written that you found.
Yeah.
Just so amazing.
Well, it didn't happen just right away, click, 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 because my mother was seeing Clifford Odets, and she came to Hollywood to do a film. And she went to a party at do you know the name Richard Barthelmess? Some people
Yes.
at the
Yeah, sure.
great silent actor,
Yeah.
wonderful person, and good friend of both my father's and my mother's. And they had a party for people who were unattached. And it was Christmas Eve, and it was a very festive evening, probably lots of champagne and music and somebody playing carols at the piano and dancing. And I think my father had noticed my mother for a long time, and he couldn't quite take his eyes off of her. And finally, he came over and said, you know, would you like to go see a movie? I'd like to see The Grapes of Wrath, which had just come out. And so she said, sure. So they go to see The Grapes of Wrath, and sitting in that dark theater, I think the struggles of the Jode family coming across, trying to find a better life, being so poor, really touched something in my mother and made her tearful. And I think that her reaction touched my father, and they began to have little dinners together. And it was all seemed to her that it was just a friendship. And she was a wonderful listener. So she would ask him questions, and she drew him out, and he found himself telling her things and sharing things with her that he hadn't really shared with anyone else. And she thought that was just a sign of a lovely friendship. Now she's supposed to go back to New York to be with Clifford Odets and to see Citizen Kane. Orson Welles was dating Dolores Del Rio, my mother's close friend. They're all going to go back. And my mother knows that maybe Bob has fallen a little in love. So she has to tell him, I'm going back and I have this relationship with Odette's. And he was crestfallen. And it was really the first woman that had he'd put his hopes in for a more enduring relationship. So they don't see each other for 9 months. The relationship with Clifford Odets comes to a sad end. My mother's doing plays in New York, doing radio, and Pearl Harbor comes. And my father, who's been in London trying to help the English tell the story of why America should get into the war to begin with, he comes back and their mutual friends, Joe Swirling, the writer, and his wife say to my father, Faye would like to see you. And he says, are you sure? And they say, yes, she's waiting for your call. And he calls her and races over there.
It's like the end of a third act.
And it was just, that was it. It solidified it. They talked all night. As she said, they shared 1,000 kisses, and they finally find each other. But there were obstacles along the way. And that was at the outbreak of the war. So much of their early relationship and their marriage is built around what now happens for Hollywood, for him and for her during.
She's doing radio as much as she can to help the war effort. And he becomes the head, I guess, of the film department of the OWI, right?
He's the head of the overseas film department. There was a domestic division, and there was a division to make movies that would be seen overseas, so that as the Allied forces would move across North Africa and up into Sicily and Italy, they would show these films to tell the story of what America was really like.
So they showed them to the population that they had just freed, as well as the soldiers. It was a good propaganda for the soldiers that were still there too, both, right?
Well, I think yes, but the primary question was, these people who've been living under fascism have been fed a steady diet of how horrible America is, how dangerous it is, how venomous people are. And so how are you going to tell those people with liberating forces not to be afraid, and that America has a good story to tell? It was an interesting challenge, because you can't just get up in front of a camera and say, we're great people and here's our flag. And, so he told them, they made 26 films, short films. They were 10, 15 minutes long. And it's a wonderful collection that is now in the National Archives, but it was called Projections of America. And some of the stories were about the great cities of America. But for example, in New York, instead of telling it's a great city, they tell the story of the guy who washes the windows on the Empire State Building, and a sort of Buster Keaton character who you kind of fall in love with. And Ingrid Bergman did a story about the life of the immigrants from Sweden in America and settling the center part of the country. And one about called The Autobiography of a Jeep. And it's the story of the Jeep and the manufacturing of it, but told in the voice of the Jeep, and how nobody was going to have, everybody thought it was ugly and nobody thought it could do anything, and it had to prove itself. And so it's this little, do you remember the little engine that could when you were a kid? It was that kind of story. And then they did a great one on Toscanini leaving Italy and coming to America because he wanted to be free. And they interview him, and then he plays Requiem, Verdi's Requiem, Hymn of the Nations, and with the NBC Orchestra. And it's very patriotic, but it doesn't say, you know, is a great country. It just says America's made up a lot of different qualities of ingenuity, a sense of freedom, a sense of.
I heard that last night from Michelle Obama.
Yeah, Michelle Obama should have been in a Riskin movie. She was exactly that, which is, I think, what, you know, we've lost the connective tissue with
How does one see these? Is there a way to see these films?
well, some of them are on YouTube, but I will promote. There's a documentary called Projections of America, and maybe someone can post that title on in the chat box. It's called Projections of America. It's a documentary about my father and about these movies.
Wow.
And it's on Netflix.
Netflix. I'm going to watch it tonight.
You can watch it tonight. And I'm interviewed in it, but that's the least interesting part. The part that's interesting is, and this was really very helpful to me in writing the book, because these documentary filmmakers wanted to do a story about my dad, and it's a much bigger film program than any of the others that were done during World War II. 26 short films, plus he was in charge of selecting all the Hollywood entertainment films to be shown overseas. It was a huge job. So, but when the documentary filmmakers who I really liked, Peter Miller, who had worked with Ken Burns, did this film, they said, do you have anything you can share with us? And I went through every box. I went back to all the letters my parents had written. I put them all in chronological order. I was painting the picture of their lives and my father's life as best as I could from what I had to give to them. And they used a great deal of it. And the final shot, do you know where the final shot is? You can't even imagine, but it's at the Motion Picture Country Home. We called it then the Motion Picture.
I was going to go there next. Obviously, you have an older brother who was born, I think, in 1943.
Right.
And at the end of the war, you come along, and it's, you know, these are two people who have kind of given up their lives of other stuff to do things for the war effort. But then they move into a great house in Stone Canyon, and you grow up there for your first few years. And then tragedy happens. I'm sorry to have to ask you about this, but the Motion Picture Home has so much to do with you and your family.
Well, that's right. So Christmas 1950, the day after Christmas, my father came home from the studio, 20th Century Fox, with a terrible headache. Came home in the morning. He was having a stroke. They didn't know that. Terrible headache. They race him to the hospital. And then days that follow, he has brain surgery. They thought he had a brain tumor. He did not. And he never really recovered from that massive stroke. And life just took a huge turn for the
You
whole.
were only 5 years old.
I was 5 years old, just turning 6, I think, or whatever. But I just, as I said in the book, I felt as though someone had gone through the house and turned out all the lights. It was just so sad. And it was hard. And so my mother did an amazing thing. He was in the hospital for a month, and he was struggling to find his way back into sort of consciousness, you know. And so she wrote down everything he said or tried to say, because she thought he would get well and that it would be fascinating to him to see how the mind was. And some of the things that he was saying were relating back to the war and being on the road and looking for Danny Kaye and thinking Danny Kaye would be great to have in a movie for the OWI. You know, it was all mushed around. Anyway, he came home and she tried to care for him at home for a couple of years, and he was not getting better. And so family came to the Motion Picture Home, and asked if he could be cared for in the long-term care, the nursing home component of it. And so I remember going over the hill, the Sepulveda Pass, to visit him on weekends. And I know for him, it must have been very hard because he had enough consciousness to worry about his children, to worry about Faye. But she was a resilient spirit. And she went to Lou Wasserman and said, Lou, I need to go back to work. And he said, let's start Monday. And he put her in television series and got her back in action again. I got through that without.
I understand. That's
Yeah.
tough to talk about. Well, maybe we'll talk about a funny moment.
Yeah. Well, before you go to the, I just want to say thank you to the Motion Picture Fund and for what you do for people. I just have a special place in my heart for all of you. So now you can go to the funny moment.
Well, a funny moment is, I guess, later in the 50s now, your mom's doing television, a few movies, and she's invited to go to China with Norman Lear, Mary Tyler Moore, and Carl Reiner. And what happened in China?
Well, no, actually, I was the one who went with Norman Lear, not my mother.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
The story doesn't work unless I go.
Sorry.
We go to China. Norman Lear, this is 1978, and China is just opening up, and Mao is dead, right? And so they're making these cultural exchanges with different professional groups, doctors and scientists and so on. And they invite Norman Lear to put together a trip that they pay for, the Chinese government pays for. And we were lucky enough to be included with this group that included Mary Tyler Moore and Grant Tinker and Carl Reiner and his wife Estelle and Larry Gelbart. And we get to China. Now, everybody, you have to imagine this, is wearing Mao suits. And there are almost no cars. Everybody's going everywhere by bicycle. It's still very much just on the tail of the Cultural Revolution. And no one has seen any movies or television from the West in 40 years or whatever. So Mary Tyler Moore, after a while, says, it's really wonderful to be someplace where I'm not bothered. She was the darling of America with her wonderful show. People don't come up to me. I can just roam freely. And so without being bothered. Of course, there was after a while she kind of missed the attention, but so we're introduced now, we're invited to meet the Vice Minister of Cultural Affairs in a big room with overstuffed chairs and doilies and thermoses of tea, very old world China. And Norman, who is one of the great hosts of all time, is going around the room introducing everybody with their credits, right? So he gets to Mary Tyler Moore, and she has the biggest hit show in America, and everyone knows her and loves her. And the Chinese are looking at her and they say, oh, they don't know from Mary Tyler Moore. They're totally uninterested. Then they get to Carl Reiner, as he's the funniest man, brilliant writer. He wrote this, that, and the other thing. Chinese never heard of him. And finally they get to me, and Norman says, well, I'm not sure what to say about Vicky. She's a clinical psychologist, but her mother was Fay Wray, who's in King Kong. Oh! And they start jumping up and down. I became the center of attention. And I'm looking at Mary, she's kind of glaring at me at this point because she's feeling invisible, and I'm being fussed over. So Kong became a little bit of a calling card for me, and at least in my visit to China.
Great story. So Jen Clymer, I understand, has a question, and I think she wanted to jump on in, Jen.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you again for being part of the show today. And this is our second Behind the Book. We're so excited. One of the things that we've been doing through the pandemic, is this live broadcast. It's a creative platform for the residents. It gives everybody a chance to stay connected and have something else to focus on rather than the 24-hour news cycle or the four walls that are surrounding them.
Yes, understood.
So what we've been doing throughout this, which is kind of a common denominator for everybody that comes on, is we ask what your favorite movie is and why.
Okay. Well, I have two favorite movies. Can I have two?
You can have as many as you want.
Okay. So number one, I just love His Girl Friday. It's like I've played it over and over again, and I know the lines, and I love the way they talk over each other. And anything with Cary Grant is delicious.
It was just on yesterday on TCM.
I mean, if I owned it, the sprockets would have been worn out by now. It's just. And then there's another little movie that David and I like to play when we just want to have fun. And nobody's probably heard of this movie, but I'm giving it to you free. And it's called Let It Ride with Richard Dreyfuss and Terry Garr. Okay, I'll just give you the setup. He's a cab driver who can't stop betting on horses. And the opening is she's going to leave him if he doesn't give up gambling. And I don't want to tell you anything else, but it's hilarious. It's the best, one of the best cast movies, comedy movies. Wally Nacita, you probably worked with her at some point. Anyway, she cast this film. The minor parts are just extraordinary. Crazy bunch of characters, and they play off each other brilliantly. So of course he can't stop gambling because he gets a hot tip that he says is not really a hot tip. This is actual information, and from there is the ups and the downs of this marriage and his gambling. Okay, I don't want to say anymore.
Is it the comic version of Uncut Gems?
I can't say because I don't know.
I can tell you that movie was in trouble, and they called a man named Howard W. Koch to come in and take over that movie as the producer. So I know it very well, Vicki.
Well, whoever produced it did a great job, and I understand there was a difficult director on that movie, but I can't say.
Very difficult, yes.
Everyone says, how could he? No one seems to say anything too good about that guy, but it came out brilliantly.
Do I get to give my two movies, Jen, or just?
Yeah, yes, of course. I also want to say at this moment, if you are a resident on the campus and you've got a question and want to call in, please, by all means, do that. We are going to be ordering a couple of copies of the book and adding them to our prize zone for the game shows, the trivia, all of that stuff. So you can choose that book in the very near future.
Right. So if somebody does have a question from Facebook or from the home that maybe stumps Vicki or me, or in some way enlightens us, maybe Vicki will send a copy of the book to you signed. How about that?
That would be amazing. I'm going to look around on Facebook as well and see if we've got questions there. I want to thank Myra and Paul also for their questions and comments earlier.
So my favorite, written by the Epstein brothers and Howard Koch, no relation to me or my father, is Casablanca, because it's the great love story. I can watch it. I know every line from that movie.
So I have a picture right here of Julie Epstein and my mother when they were in their 80s, right? A photograph. We went
used to walk around Stone Canyon, that little golf course on Beverly Glen and what's that little pitch and putt? Beverly Glen.
Yeah, it's now a park, right? But
yeah, a little park. And my other movie, my comedy, for me always has to be Young Frankenstein.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Now, Casablanca, it should come as no surprise, has many votes already on our list of all-time greatest movies.
But my favorite line of all time is, "Put the Kindle back."
And Terry Garr making a couple of appearances on the show today.
Terry Garr. I love Terry.
And we
Yes.
recently rewatched Oh God because one of the movie channels put a whole bunch of Carl Reiner movies up back to back to back. And she's genius in that as well. We do have someone that has a question, and let me find him. And Michael Glick. Whoops.
Can you hear me? Oops.
Yes.
Hi, Michael.
Hi there. How are you? Listen, I'm just thrilled about this discussion. This was just wonderful. Absolutely brings back a lot of memories. Vicki, I don't want to pry into your personal life, but do you have a relation by the name of Ralph Riskin?
Yes, I do. And Ralph was my cousin. He was the son of Everett, my father's brother, and he just passed away. So Michael, how did you know Ralph?
I went through grammar school and high school with him. He was always a very good trumpet player, and I was always in his group. I was never as good as him. So he was my idol. Wonderful, good-looking guy, just a super person. And I'm so sorry to hear he passed away.
And he has a son who he's a wonderful young man, and the son's name is Robert Riskin.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
My father gave him a camera because he was interested in photography. My father was always giving presents to people, especially in his family, but friends, just because he sensed that would make them happy. And it would, he listened carefully to what they wanted. Anyway, Ralph we were quite close. Yeah.
I've had a lot of very wonderful memories of him. Thank you very much.
And Michael is and was a great production manager, producer. Did we work together as an AD, Mike? I don't know, but
We might have. We might have. But, it was always a pleasure being around you and associated with you because you bring out the best in everybody.
Thank you,
We love Michael for so many reasons, not the least of which is he has volunteered his time on the campus and has helped people in the gym and through a couple of other our volunteer programs. We've got a call from a resident. Hello.
Hi, it's
Hi.
Margot Winchester.
Hi, Margot.
Hi. Do you want to ask me a question?
Yes, please. I think, Vicki, can you hear Margot?
Yes, Margot, go ahead.
Hi, Vicki. We're mutual friends from Barbara Gordakoff. My dear friend.
Oh my gosh, she's my best friend. I love her.
Writing anything now? What's in store?
I have the paperback is coming out of this book, but it's going to be with the University of Kentucky Press. So they're sort of reissuing it like a whole new book. So that's kind of taking up my time. And since I moved to a new house on Martha's Vineyard, I'm still unpacking. And so I don't know what I'm going to write next. We'll see. I sort of follow the.
Thank you. Is David writing anything? Your husband? He's an old friend.
Hey, take it easy on the olds there, Margot.
Is he writing anything?
He's a good guy. He has 2 plays that he's working on, and one they were both sort of in the pipeline to be produced. One in London and one in New York or in Boston, and they're on hold, as you can imagine. One is an adaptation of Sophie's Choice.
Wow.
With the stage. And
I very much enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot.
Bye-bye.
Bye. We've got a potential question to stump you from Facebook.
Okay.
Myra asks, who was the stunt double who doubled Bruce Cabot?
Okay, I have no idea.
It wasn't Hal Needham, that I could tell you.
All right, so you are officially stumped. The answer is Gil Perkins.
Oh, I knew Gil. You're kidding. Wow.
So, well done, Myra.
Okay.
There's a question, or I guess a comment from Scott Johnson. Who
Yes.
knew that Grapes of Wrath was a kind of rom-com of the era? Nice to know people fell in love to it.
Well, and Freda's father-in-law wrote it. Nunnally
Who's-
John.
Oh yes, Nunnally Johnson. That's right.
And that's her husband. That's Scott.
I mean,
Nunley's son.
Her husband.
He just asked the question.
Ah,
And that's Bob Beecher talking, the CEO of MPTF, for those of you on Facebook who may not have recognized his voice. Bob, you should turn your camera on and share.
there he is.
No, I was just saying that Scott Johnson is Nunnally's son, Freda's husband.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
they were thrilled to learn that the first date was the Grapes of Wrath. A nice connection to their family.
Wonderful film. I want to watch it again because I haven't seen it for a while, but it's sort of relevant for today's what's going on, right?
Yeah.
No kidding. So I have another question that I don't think, well, maybe I asked you before, but have you,
Happens when you get a little older, you don't remember what you just said,
Yeah.
right?
do you think you've changed because of writing this memoir?
I think it's deepened my appreciation and understanding, not only for my parents in a much deeper way. I mean, I think I mentioned this in the book. I could not read their love letters for a long time. It was just too emotional for me, right? Having lost my dad. So I think I found my way back to them. And it's funny, when you're a little kid, you think of your parents as tall and big and, and then as you get older, you become the same height, psychologically speaking. I feel I know them as people, and I found them incredibly interesting. And I don't think, I just think it's transformed me so that I know them in this wonderful new way without judgment or needs or happiness or disappointment or loss, any of those things. It all got worked out. And I had a great time, for example, researching my father's first girlfriend. And I was like on a mission for months looking for what might have happened to her. And wasn't easy, but I still have this obsession trying to find what happened to this woman. And some of her family have been in touch with me, because of the book. So even though I couldn't solve the mystery exactly in the book, I'm still curious about her because she came from a tiny little Appalachian town in Kentucky and found herself in Broadway, working for Sam Harris, the great entrepreneur, entrepreneur and producer and an actress and a very successful writer. She wrote wonderful short stories for the Saturday Evening Post and came to Hollywood and then wrote for Greta Garbo at MGM. That was the big studio, right? And then she disappeared by about 1939. And the only thing I have is her death certificate 20 years later. So, it was fascinating to just get really interested in people without any emotional confusion about it.
Well, as I think probably everybody at the home knows, prep is everything. We always talk about that before you're making a movie.
Yeah.
If you're not prepped correctly, there's going to be a lot of problems on the set making the movie. And just a great compliment to you, the amount of research and the depth in which I really felt like I know your mother and father because of what you gave me. And I must say, I got emotional when both of them, each time that they were gone. It was pretty emotional for me, and I didn't know them at all, but so you did just an amazing job, and thank you for doing this. I wondered, are there other memoirs of parents written by the son or the daughter that maybe I'm not aware of? Because I don't know how many other memoirs are written with this kind of depth about their parents.
You know, I think I have to say, in all due modesty, this stands alone.
I wanted you to say that because I think you're right.
I'll tell you why, because I think sometimes memoirs are written still with that child's consciousness, telling the story fairly, but not with context. Was important for me, not just to tell their story, but the times they lived in, the Depression, the growth of the motion picture industry, the conflicts going on, the labor wars in Hollywood. There was so much happening around them that they were part of, but wasn't. But I had to understand all that, bring the history into the story, and then there are other books about famous people that are written from the point of view of a great observer, but there's always sort of a distance between the writer and the reality. So I was hoping to fit this other kind of niche that would be both those things. It would be intimate, but it would have a bigger platform and a bigger landscape. So I particularly liked, though, Sam Wesson's book that you did last week. I thought he did a really good job, and he has a kind of energetic style. I'm sure he was an energetic interview, but I felt at times he did get inside the story that he was telling. That's rare. Usually people are a little bit more academic and,
Right. Well, I have to tell you, not having not known you and just spending the last couple of weeks with your book and now spending the last couple of days with you, I am better for knowing you, and thank you for writing it and for allowing me the opportunity to be with you. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful experience to talk to you. You bring out the best of me. Now I'm going to go beat the dog.
Vicki, it's Bob. I just wanted to say it's been a real blessing to all of us to have you in conversation with Hawk this afternoon. It's been really marvelous. To Freda and Jen's point at the beginning, this has been a rough 5 months for our residents, and to be able to have an hour and a half respite like this and hear two really smart people talk about old Hollywood and the lives of parents and others is just been really wonderful. So thank you for bringing that light to us today.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and it's a wonderful business when it's good. It's really, really good, and when it's bad, it's awful, right? But but there's so many more good people and good things that. Yeah.
When
Absolutely.
everything is back to some state of normal and you find yourself on the West Coast, please come back, visit the campus, get to see all the changes that have happened, and how we continue to take care of our own.
Well, it would be my honor and my pleasure and my privilege to do that.
Yeah, although we have a 110-year-old resident, I don't think we have any staff who was here when your father was here.
Oh, 110, bravo. Oh my goodness, that's my goal. That's amazing. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Freda, you're still on mute, so unmute yourself and help take this home.
Okay, thank you, Vicki, so much. I can't say anything more than Hawk or Bob already has said. The book is so moving. You are so fair, brought so much context to the golden age of Hollywood. It really was like getting to know you and getting your family. And can't wait to have you on campus and share some more stories. So thank you very much.
And
all our lives.
We'll see you in a few weeks, the rest of the residents. We'll see you with another, hopefully at least half as good as the time we got to have with Vicki. So
very high bar here, very high bar.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you.
everyone there.